Good morning, Magic. I'm Gavin Verhey from Wizards of the Coast. And on top of designing Magic cards, you might also recall that I'm on the Pauper format panel, the group who helps maintain the Pauper format. We on the PFP wanted to check in and give you a really transparent behind-the-scenes update on where we see the format right now, our thoughts, potential future bannings, and more. It's kind of an unprecedented look at our thoughts in progress, and I'd love to hear from you with what you think about them. Ready to dig in? Let's go for it. The Pauper format panel was formed a year ago this month, and what a year 2022 was. The format has changed a lot since then. We kicked things off with some big bans targeted toward Tron and Affinity, taking down Atog, Prophetic Prism, and Bonder's Ornament. These were aimed at weakening Tron's eternal grip on the format and Affinity's explosive finishes. After seeing how the dust settled there, we cracked back in and took action on Disciple of the Vault as another knock to Affinity and a Galvanic Relay to help curtail some explosive storm decks. We also unbanned Expedition Map to give Tron a tool back in its tool belt after it fell off the, map. Finally, later in the year, with Commander Legends Battle for Baldur's Gate, we had to take action after the big explosion of initiative decks, taking down Aarakocra Sneak, Stirring Bard, Underdark Explorer, and Vicious Battle Rager. So how did all of that go? Well, the Tron bans have worked out pretty well, and now the deck is in a spot we're happy with for now. Especially after the addition of Energy Refractor in Brothers War, the deck is firmly back on the Expedition map. While it's a little less efficient than it was before, it's still being quite successful. The initiative bans have similarly seemed to work out well, shutting off the existence of Turbo Initiative left and right everywhere, while you still see it played in some mid-range decks more fairly. This is more or less what we had hoped would happen with Initiative, so that worked out great. The Galvanic Relay ban pretty clearly helped shut down that Storm deck from being an issue as well. The one that has been more of a controversial topic is Affinity. Two big bans later, the deck is still kicking as one of the best decks in the format. This is always one of the most active discussions in the PFP about Affinity's success week to week and if more needs to be done. More on that in a little bit. While that's a good recap of what you've seen us do, what you don't see is that we're constantly talking all year, even when changes aren't being made about what's going on. Whether new decks to keep an eye on, potential banning discussions that didn't come to pass, league analyses, and more. So let's talk about some of where we're at right now. When you look at the format by the numbers and crunch into the data, here's the gist of it. There are 4 decks that are clearly at the top of the format: Grixis Affinity, Mono Red, Dimir Terror, and Kawgate. 2022 was a year that actually had a number of big Pauper impacts. In addition to things that got banned, I'm looking at you Initiative, we saw the downshift of Monastery Swiftspear and addition of Experimental Synthesizer, giving a gigantic boost to mono red strategies, Tolarian Terror, opening up a whole new archetype in Dimir Terror, and Basilisk Gate, letting people kill with Squadron Hawks and Sacred Cats. 3 of these sit among these top 4 decks. Now, another interesting wrinkle is that it's far from a 4-deck format. While these 4 decks have taken up roughly 60% of the field share in recent challenges, the remaining roughly 40% is a smattering of mini decks. Boggles, Fairies, Naya Gates, Orzhov Ephemerate, Tron, Wall Combo, and several others. And they're not just there to get beaten up on. These decks actually are successful, making top 8s of Magic Online challenges or even winning with regularity. Additionally, looking at the matchup data, the metagame is actually fairly balanced. Affinity and Red have a little higher percentages than the other of the big 4, but not to a necessarily problematic level. When it comes to Eternal format health, 4 decks on top with a lot of successful decks underneath is pretty good. It could be more diverse, but it could be a lot less diverse, and frequently has during Pauper's history. Doing any bans could hurt this careful balance and really change the format. So strictly by the numbers, it looks like things are fairly decent. There is a pretty good reason for no bans here, and that's why we haven't made any. However, the numbers aren't the only thing to factor in here. When considering the player experience, a lot more goes into it than just how the numbers look. 2 big ones are repetition and freshness. In the case of repetition, or how often it feels like you're playing against the same decks, especially at the speed of which Affinity and Red play, it feels like you play against them a lot. They're strategies that have fast games and players can pick up and be successful with little experience, which makes them more likely to show up as well. And many players dislike losing to something like a burn deck. It feels like if they get a good draw, it's hard to line up your strategy to beat them. Or put another way, you lose your sense of agency in that Pauper match. And then, in terms of freshness, as in how stale does the format feel, Affinity has been one of the top decks since Modern Horizons 2 hit with its bridges in 2021, and even before that, it was still a good deck you could play. Burn is much the same, where it's existed since the inception of the format, and it's pretty much always been playable. Both decks are fine when you see them sometimes, but can be considerably more frustrating when they're at the prominent level they are, playing against them multiple times in an event. Another aspect of this is context as well. In the last year, as we've seen just in this overview alone, Pauper has changed a lot. In addition to bans, many sets have had cards which added new archetypes or changed the format. And now that we've had several months without the format changing a lot and things are settling down, it feels like things are more stagnant. That's actually something to be expected for an eternal format, to not be changing all the time, but especially for people who have joined the format as it's grown in the past year or become accustomed to this rapid rate of change, it feels different. Is it worth making a ban just to shake things up? This is something that different people have different thoughts about, and I'd love to hear yours in the comments down below. Usually, I favor not banning just for the sake of shaking up the format, because that's a slippery path to go down, which results in more bans. But the argument of this being a specific situation and some people not enjoying playing against Affinity and Burn is a real one. If these decks are sapping substantially more than they're adding to the format, something needs to change. So let me walk you through some things we've been discussing. The first is what to ban if Affinity if we do. It's the #1 deck, yes, it's more successful than Burn, and a deck that has had bans already. If we wanted to make a big move and really hit the deck, we could ban artifact lands. This would either be the 10 bridges or the 5 original artifact lands. There are pros and cons to both. Each of them splash damages other things. For example, bridges have been played in other enjoyable ways with cards like Cleansing Wildfire, though that's mostly fallen off now, while the original untapped artifact lands get used in a myriad of other decks for synergy. The biggest delta though is just how weak you want the deck to be to Gorilla Shaman. The indestructible bridges insulate it well against that card, but if all you have is the Mirrodin artifact lands, it's a total hammer to the strategy. If we banned either of those cycles, it would really damage the deck and potentially change the structure of the whole format. It could be for the better, it could also be for the worse. It's on the table, of course, to then return a card like Atog or Disciple to the deck, but we would wait until after we saw the impacts of this change to make an unbanning. Another avenue is to do some more selective bannings. One of the problems though is that it's not totally clear what the cards to hit even are because of the amount of redundancy in the deck. Do you hit Krark Clan Shaman to help make it weaker to creature decks? Mirror Enforcer to stop its big threats? Galvanic Blast to weaken its burn potential? Deadly Dispute to hit a bit of card draw and color fixing? A lot of these cards are replaceable. The deck has a wealth of options. If there's 1 or 2 non-land cards you would want to see banned, let us know in the comments. Okay, so that's Affinity. Moving on with Burn, it's not clear something has to go if we hit Affinity, because when Burn is the top deck and it's the best aggro deck, it's easier to sideboard cards for it. But if we wanted to knock a card from Burn in addition to Affinity at the same time, it could be Monastery Swiftspear to help reset the deck to where it was before Double Masters 2022, or Experimental Synthesizer, which has been a format all-star across multiple decks. But Swiftspear is a beloved card, and Synthesizer has real splash damage. Banning a burn spell is a dangerous and ultimately not that useful path to go down because of the amount of redundancy available. In the history of Magic, there are so many strong 1 and 2 mana burn spells, with more to come, that it's not a super viable path. It's also worth noting that there are some through lines between the two decks. For example, Galvanic Blast and Great Furnace are cards both decks play. They're minor knocks, but it's worth noting if we ban the original artifact lands or Galvanic Blast, it would nudge both decks down. Beyond that, I don't think we would want to take additional action until we saw how this shook out. Changing these factors is likely to flip pieces of the whole format, and while it could just be the other top 2 decks, Kawgate and Dimir Terror, coming out on top, a metagame is more nuanced than that. For example, Tron, which often preys on control decks, could be up for a big resurgence in this case. These are things we're talking about right now, and we wanted to give you a heads up in case there is a banning on this scale in the not too distant future. Finally, there's one other thing I want to talk about: unbans. We've been talking some recently about if there's anything that can come off the ban list. Many of the cards on the ban list are there because of combo decks, and we're not planning to change any of those. However, there are a couple cards we have discussed recently: Sinkhole and Hymn to Turok. These are interesting cards in that they were never really in the format. When the format's ban list was unified in 2019 to include Pauper and Magic Online legalities, these cards were banned, and they weren't legal online before, so the world has never really known a format with either of these. Additionally, Mono Black is always a popular archetype, and it's been a little too weak recently, and one or even both of these would give extra tools to those decks. The downside of both cards, however, is that neither is very enjoyable to play against. 2-mana land destruction is absolutely backbreaking, especially for decks like Tron, and Hymn to Turok creates so many non-games by just hitting 2 critical cards, lands included, on the second turn. Ultimately, I think neither of these is likely to come back on fun factor alone, and it's hard for me personally to imagine the format as more net enjoyable with these cards in it, but I'm happy to hear thoughts in the comments. Now, to be clear, none of these changes, bans or unbans, are things we are making today. These are just things we've been talking about. Our thoughts could change, or we could go another route entirely. We on the PFP think it's important to let you know we're thinking and talking about these kinds of topics, and also this gives you a heads up that action, potentially on a large scale, could be coming down the pipeline soon. Right now, we're not planning to take action, if any, until after we see the results of Phyrexia All Will Be One on the format after it releases in early February. There's a Magic Online Pauper Super Qualifier at the end of this month, and we both want to see the results from that event and also not radically redefine the format for players before then. On behalf of the whole PFP, hopefully you enjoyed this look and transparency inside what we're thinking about when it comes to Pauper. Please let us know what you think in the comments down below. Until next time, may you face all the right matchups. You got this. Wing Commando and Dwarven Forge Chanter are 2 commons you're likely to see with Prowess. You'll want to look out for cantrips that draw you cards, and keep in mind that Prowess isn't just instants and sorceries. Non-creature artifacts also trigger it, so you can use those for a little boost as well. The new Young Pyromancer, 3rd Path Iconoclast, fills a perfect role here by giving you